The resignation letter was still open on my laptop when my phone rang. I remember that detail so clearly. I'd been staring at the blinking cursor for 20 minutes, trying to find words polite enough to quit a job I hated when my uncle's number lit up the screen. He never called me directly. In 11 years, not once. I knew before I answered. My father had built Caldwell and Associates from a single-room office in Columbus, Ohio, into a regional architecture firm with 42 employees in projects across 6 states. He was 61 years old, sharp as ever, and he had been dead for 3 hours by the time I found out. Massive heart attack. His assistant found him slumped at his drafting table, a coffee mug still warm beside him. I drove the 4 hours from Chicago to Columbus in something that felt less like grief and more like static. My hands were on the wheel, my eyes were on the road, but I wasn't really there. I kept thinking about the last time I'd seen him, Thanksgiving, 2 months earlier. He'd walked me to my car in the driveway, and he'd held both my hands, the way he used to when I was little, and he'd said, "You're the best thing I ever made, Ivy. Better than any building." I hadn't known that was goodbye. My stepmother met me at the front door of the house I grew up in. Her name was Sandra. My father had married her 4 years ago after a courtship that lasted 8 months, fast, by any measure. But my father was a decisive man. He decided on things quickly and completely. He decided on Sandra the same way he decided on materials for a building. He examined her carefully, made his choice, and never second-guessed it. I had tried, genuinely, to accept her. She was stylish and intelligent, and she ran a successful event planning business. She was 10 years younger than my father, and 15 years older than me. She wasn't cruel exactly. She was just precise. Every conversation with her felt like a transaction. She never asked how I was without immediately pivoting to what she needed from me. Still, she was my father's wife. I respected that. At the door, she embraced me briefly, the way you hug someone you've just met at a networking event. She smelled like expensive perfume, and her arms barely touched my back. "I'm glad you made it safely," she said. "It's been a very long day." The house was already full of people, my father's colleagues, neighbors, a few distant relatives I barely recognized. Someone had put out a cheese board. There was soft jazz playing from the Bluetooth speaker in the living room. I stood in the entryway of the house where I'd learned to ride a bike, where I'd done my homework at the kitchen table, where my father had taught me to read blueprints before I turned 10, and I felt like a guest. That night, after everyone left, Sandra sat across from me at the kitchen table with a glass of white wine and told me very calmly that she would be handling all the funeral arrangements herself. He had very specific preferences, she said. I know what he would have wanted. I nodded. I was too hollow to argue. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing yet, was that Sandra had already made several other decisions. Ones that had nothing to do with the funeral. My father had never talked to me explicitly about his will. We discussed the firm in general terms. I'd worked there for 3 years after architecture school before moving to Chicago to join a different practice. I knew he was proud of what he'd built. I knew he wanted it to continue, but the specifics of what would happen to Caldwell and Associates after he died, that it always felt like a distant, abstract conversation. The kind you keep meaning to have and never quite do. Sandra, apparently, had done a great deal of thinking about it. The funeral was on a Thursday. My father's colleagues gave beautiful eulogies. His oldest friend talked about the early days, when the firm was just the two of them sharing a drafting table and surviving on bad coffee. One of his former interns, now a licensed architect herself, described how he pushed her to trust her own instincts. I sat in the front pew and stared at the mahogany casket and thought, he would have hated this much mahogany. Too heavy. Wrong proportions. That made me smile for exactly 3 seconds before I started crying again. Afterward, at the reception, Sandra positioned herself at the center of every conversation. She was gracious and composed, and she accepted condolences like someone collecting them. I drifted through the rooms of my childhood home feeling increasingly invisible, until Sandra found me in the hallway outside my father's study. "Ivy," she said. "There's something we should discuss." She had clearly been planning exactly how to say this. Her posture was too deliberately relaxed, the way people look when they rehearse something in a mirror. "Your father's estate is going to require a great deal of management," she said. "I'll be taking over the firm in the interim, of course, as his spouse. I've already spoken with the board." I stared at her. "The board doesn't run the firm. My father ran the firm." "Yes, well, things will need to transition." She smoothed her sleeve. "I think it would be cleaner, for everyone, if you step back from any involvement for now. You're based in Chicago anyway. I'm sure your work there keeps you busy." I couldn't speak for a moment. "Sandra. My father started that company in 1997. I grew up in that office. I have a degree in architecture." "You haven't worked there in 3 years," she said, not unkindly, worse, clinically, as if she were simply correcting a factual error. "And probate can take time. Let me manage this. It will be easier." She patted my arm once, the way you pat a dog, and walked back toward the reception. I stood there in the hallway outside my father's study, where I had watched him work my entire childhood, where he taught me that a good structure starts with an honest foundation, and I felt the floor shift under me. She moved fast. Within a week of the funeral, Sandra had called a meeting with the firm's senior associates and introduced herself as interim director. She had new business cards printed. She signed off on a project contract my father had been negotiating for months, with her name at the bottom, not his. My father's attorney, a man named Mr. Holloway, who had handled his affairs for over a decade, called me 8 days after the funeral to schedule the formal will reading. "Just you and Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "as your father specified." Sandra arrived at Holloway's office in a charcoal blazer, looking like she was attending a board meeting rather than the reading of her late husband's will. She set her bag on the table and checked her phone twice before Holloway even sat down. I sat across from her with my hands folded in my lap, trying to breathe steadily. Holloway opened the will and read through the initial provisions. The house to Sandra, a portion of personal savings, jewelry, the car. Sandra's expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see the slight relaxation of her shoulders with each item. She was counting, I realized. She was tallying. Then he got to the firm. "With regard to Caldwell and Associates Architecture, LLC," Holloway read, "I leave the entirety of my ownership stake, including all associated equity, contracts, client relationships, and intellectual property, to my daughter, Ivy Caldwell, effective immediately upon my death." The room was very quiet. I looked up. Sandra's jaw was tight. Her hands were flat on the table. She was very still in the way that a person becomes still when they are working extremely hard not to react. Holloway continued reading. There were provisions for staff, for a particular long-term client, for the retirement accounts of 2 employees who had been with my father since the beginning. Sandra received a financial settlement. Substantial, fair, but the firm itself, the thing she had already begun quietly absorbing, was mine. "There's one additional provision," Holloway said, and the way he said it, a slight pause before it, measured, made me feel that he had been waiting to read this part. He looked at Sandra directly. "Mr. Probasney, Caldwell included the following clause. In the event that any party, including but not limited to my spouse, takes action to restrict, remove, or otherwise obstruct my daughter Ivy's access to or involvement with Caldwell and Associates within 90 days of my death, whether through termination, exclusion from firm communications, removal of access credentials, or any other means, that party shall immediately forfeit their financial settlement as described above, said funds to be redirected in full to an independent trust in Ivy's name." Sandra's face did not change, but her hand, the one closest to me, curled slowly into a fist. Holloway set down the document. He looked at Sandra over the rim of his reading glasses. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said quietly, "you called a staff meeting 9 days ago in which you informed the senior associates that Ivy would not be involved in the firm's operations going forward. The silence was absolute. You also had her access credentials to the firm's project management system deactivated 6 days ago. Our office received the documentation from your IT vendor this morning." Sandra's mouth opened slightly, closed. The 90-day window, Holloway continued, folding his hands on the desk, began the day of Mr. Caldwell's death. Your actions occurred within that window. She looked at him. Then she looked at me. For the first time since I'd arrived at her door after my father died, Sandra did not look composed. She looked the way I'd felt standing in that hallway, untethered, like the floor had moved. That can't be, she started. The clause is legally binding, Holloway said. Mr. Caldwell had it reviewed by 2 independent attorneys before executing the will. I can provide you with their contact information if you'd like to seek a second opinion, but I would be doing you a disservice if I suggested you'd find a different answer. I've thought a lot in the months since about what my father knew. He knew Sandra. He loved her. I believe that, genuinely. But he also knew exactly who she was. He had spent his entire career reading structures, testing load-bearing points, identifying where something might fail under pressure. He applied the same methodology to everything. He had seen the way she positioned herself at his firm's anniversary party, working the room like she was already the senior partner's wife in a way that meant something more than just pride. He had noticed the way she asked questions about contracts, not out of curiosity, but out of inventory. He had told me once, during the phone call I'd almost forgotten, that he'd recently made some additions to his estate planning. Just being thorough, he'd said. You know how I am. I hadn't asked what he meant. I wish I had. Not because it would have changed anything. He had handled it quietly the way he handled everything. But because I would have liked to tell him that I understood, that I knew he was protecting me even then. He had built a structure around me, load-bearing walls I didn't know were there until the pressure came and they held. Sandra's attorney contacted Holloway 3 days later to dispute the clause. Holloway sent over the documentation from both independent reviewers. We didn't hear from her attorney again after that. Sandra vacated the house by the end of the month. She took the items specified in the will and left the rest. The morning after she moved out, I drove to Columbus and let myself into the house with the key I'd had since I was 16. The study still smelled like him. Pencil shavings and old books and the faint cedar of the furniture he'd bought in the 1990s and refused to replace because it was perfectly functional. Why would he replace it? I sat in his chair for a long time. On his desk, there was a framed photo I'd never noticed before. Or maybe I noticed it so many times it had become invisible. The 2 of us at my architecture school graduation. I'm in the robe, cap slightly crooked, squinting in the sun. He has his arm around me and he's grinning. Not his professional smile, the one he used in client meetings, but the real one, the one that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. On the back, in his handwriting, the best structure I ever designed. I took a leave from my Chicago job and spent 2 months in Columbus working alongside the firm's senior associates to stabilize operations. My father had built well, the team was talented and loyal, and they had been deeply unsettled by the previous 2 weeks. What they needed was not a dramatic takeover. What they needed was continuity. I tried to give them that. There were hard days when I'd sit in the conference room looking at the project boards and think, he will never see this one finished. Days when a client would call and ask for him and I'd have to say again that he was gone. Days when I found his handwriting on a sticky note tucked under a keyboard and had to step outside for 5 minutes. But there were also days when something clicked. When I made a call on a project and it was the right call, and I could feel, somewhere underneath the grief, the particular satisfaction of doing work you were built for. I understood, for the first time, why he had never really retired even when I'd suggested it. This was not separate from who he was. It was who he was. The firm is still called Caldwell and Associates. I decided not to change the name. Not because I haven't made it my own, I have, slowly in 100 small ways, but because his name was always part of mine too. You don't build over a good foundation, you build on it. I still live partly in Chicago and partly in Columbus, splitting my weeks between the 2 cities in a way that is mildly chaotic and probably not sustainable long term. I'm working on that. I kept the study exactly as it was. The cedar furniture, the drafting table, the pencil shaving smell that I'm convinced is now permanently embedded in the walls. I work in there when I'm in Columbus. I find it easier to think clearly in that room than anywhere else I've ever been. Last week, I was on the phone with a new client, a developer in Cincinnati, big mixed-use project, the kind of work my father would have loved, and she asked me, toward the end of the call, who had trained me. My father, I said. He was an architect. He built this firm. There was a brief pause, the way there always is when people realize the name on the letterhead and the name I just said are the same. He sounds like he was remarkable, she said. I looked at the photo on the desk. The real smile, the crooked cap. He was, I said. He planned for everything. I've been sitting with this story for almost a year now, trying to figure out what it actually taught me. Not the legal part. That resolved itself cleanly, the way my father always preferred things to resolve. What I keep turning over is something quieter than that. Sandra moved fast because she believed speed was power. The morning after the funeral, she was already signing off on contracts. Within a week, she had her name on the door and my access credentials deactivated. From the outside, I imagine it looked decisive, confident, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But there's a difference between moving fast and moving wisely, and Sandra never seemed to understand that distinction. She made her biggest moves before she had complete information. She acted on assumption. Assumed the will would confirm what she'd already claimed. Assumed no one had anticipated her. Assumed that possession was the same thing as ownership. Every one of those assumptions cost her, not because the universe punished her, not because of anything mystical, but because actions taken in greed almost always skip the step where you stop and think clearly. And skipping that step has consequences. It always does. My father understood this. He spent 40 years in a profession where a single miscalculation in the early stages of a project could compromise everything built on top of it. He was meticulous in a way that some people found excessive. He reviewed contracts twice. He asked questions other people considered unnecessary. He planned for contingencies that never came, and for the ones that did. He planned for Sandra, not out of bitterness, I don't think. He loved her. But he also saw her clearly, the way he saw everything clearly, and he made provisions accordingly. He didn't warn me, didn't say anything dramatic. He just quietly built a structure that would hold. That's what I find remarkable. Not the clause itself, but the discipline it took to put it there without ever mentioning it. To love someone and still be honest about what they might do, to protect the people you care about without making a production of it. I think about that a lot when I'm in his study, working through project files at his old drafting table. There's a version of this story where I spend the rest of my life angry at Sandra, where I let what she did define how I see people, or make me bitter about the firm, or turn my grief into something harder and colder than it needed to be. I understand that version. I felt it for a while, but the thing I keep coming back to is this. Integrity isn't about what you do when people are watching. It's about what you decide when no one is. When the easier path is right there and you could take it and probably no one would ever know. Sandra had choices. At every step, the staff meeting, the access credentials, the business cards, she had a choice. She made the one that felt like winning. My father had choices too. He chose to build something honest, to treat people fairly, to plan carefully even when no one was asking him to. He made those choices for decades, quietly, without announcement. In the end, the only thing that protected me was who he had been all along. That's the part I want to remember. Not what Sandra lost, but what my father left. Not just the firm, not just the clause, but the example, the proof that how you do things matters. That patience and honesty and careful thought are not weaknesses. They are load-bearing walls. You don't see them from the outside. But when the pressure comes, they are everything.